a Russian shell could cost $1,000. A loitering Lancet drone could cost as much as $35,000. And just by counting the kind of the craters surrounding that position, so that's a lower end of the estimate of what they'd used. There are at least 20 holes surrounding this position. So that gives you an idea that the Russians are wasting certainly tens of thousands of dollars, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars, trying to destroy something that is basically, I mean, that particular one is made out of drainage pipes, lorry tires, old gas canisters. I mean, genuine rubbish that has just been sort of painted and packaged up to look like a gun. So Ukraine has been using decoy weapons to try and lure the Russians into wasting ammunition, and also to divert their attention away from where the Ukrainians actually are. I went to visit one of the factories in western Ukraine where they have been building these decoys, and interviewed some of the model makers who have been sort of creating these incredible decoys out of genuinely abandoned, old flower pots, curtain rail brackets. I mean, you name it, it all gets sort of hammered and sellotaped and glued together into this weird hodgepodge assembly that genuinely does look like an anti-tank missile or a Starlink platform or a howitzer. So it kind of speaks to the resourcefulness of the Ukrainians when they're faced by immense Russian firepower. So the decoy weapons can be made out of any household items, really. The point is that they need to appear convincing enough so that when the Russians see them, usually through a sort of reconnaissance drone, they are convincing enough that they're going to waste ammunition on it. And that's mainly the point. I mean, firstly, so that the Russians expend a lot of expensive shells, missiles, drones, trying to attack basically a piece of cardboard. That's one advantage of them. The other use is basically to try and divert attention away from where the Ukrainians actually are. So if you can imagine that you position a fake howitzer at one end of the field, and then you have your real howitzer at the other end, the point is to confuse the Russians so that they don't really know where to strike. I spoke to Mikhailo Roman, who runs a volunteer organization in western Ukraine. He's got about 40 people working for him in various workshops around the city of Vinohradiv, and he's just one of many volunteer organizations doing this. But they gave me a demonstration, for example, of the most simple, which are these Starlink platforms. They can knock one of those up in about 30 seconds. So I saw rows and rows of them sort of hanging out to dry before they're dispatched to the front line. Something bigger like a howitzer, which is pretty large, takes a bit more time. But again, they can produce them more in a handful, and sort of they take more time to sort of get to the front lines. But certainly the Starlink platforms, they can absolutely send hundreds over every week. Well, the scale is a closely guarded secret, because the Ukrainians don't want to say that we have X number of tanks, X number of rocket launchers, and X number of decoys, because that might help the Russians. But they've certainly been using it for a while, and they've been using a kind of mixture of inflatables, which are kind of slightly more bespoke decoys. They're quite a little bit more expensive, if you can imagine sort of a bouncy castle, but shaped like a tank or a rocket launcher. That's quite a kind of unique piece of kit to design. But on a kind of lower level, and I saw this myself, you could do something as simple as just getting paper mache, like you might have done when you were a kid in school, and creating Starlink platforms, which are basically a small, about the size of a laptop, and for £5 to £10 you can create a cardboard version of one of those. And that's quite an easy way of trying to sort of trick Russians about where the Ukrainians' positions are, because all the Ukrainians rely on these Starlink antennae to connect to the internet, because that's what they use on the front lines. So for let's say £10 on the for an average sort of decoy, Starlink decoy, you can you can create something that gives the idea that the Ukrainians are not exactly where they are. To give you a sense, there was one D-20 howitzer, which is kind of Soviet era gun, that was positioned in a kind of in the undergrowth of a small wood, and the Ukrainians put it there about 2 months ago, and it took a month for the Russians to see where it was, and for a month thereafter, they have basically been firing at this fake howitzer. Now, a Russian shell could cost $1,000. A loitering Lancet drone could cost as much as $35,000. And just by counting the kind of the craters surrounding that position, so that's a lower end of the estimate of what they'd used, there are at least 20 holes surrounding this position. So that gives you an idea that the Russians are wasting certainly tens of thousands of dollars, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars, trying to destroy something that is basically, I mean, that particular one is made out of drainage pipes, lorry tires, old gas canisters. I mean, genuine rubbish that has just been sort of painted and packaged up to look like a gun. Decoys have a long history in warfare. I mean, really, the first story of a battle is the Battle of Troy, and that obviously involves the Trojan horse, which is, a kind of a dummy, as it were, to sort of gain access to the city of Troy. But more recently, dummies and decoys have been very widely used, and probably the most famous example, and we're coming out to the 80th anniversary this week, is for the D-Day landings, where the Allied forces basically convinced the German High Command that the main landings would take place in Pas-de-Calais, over 100 miles north of where they eventually landed, by creating this fake army of blow-up tanks. I mean, it was so detailed they even sort of had soldiers lighting fires in the encampment, so that the Luftwaffe, when it flew overhead and was taking sort of reconnaissance pictures, could see sort of realistic smoke. It had soldiers hanging out lines of washing to sort of really convince the Germans that this was where the army was. And of course they weren't. It was nothing of the sort. But the point of that was to get the Germans to kind of prepare for an invasion, in Pas-de-Calais, much further north of where it eventually was, but also to make sure that they didn't reinforce where the Allies eventually landed very quickly, because they were kind of preparing for this second wave of all these tanks and landing craft and everything, which were all fake. In the Soviet army and the Russians have previously used inflatables as well. I mean, it's tricky to know the extent to which both sides use them, but certainly given Ukraine's lack of weapons at the moment, the value of decoys is arguably more on their side, just because they have fewer resources to work with, and so therefore they need to protect them more. Even in the weeks after Ukraine got given HIMARS, which are American rocket launchers, the Russians claimed that they had destroyed several of them, and Ukraine sort of pointed out, well, that can possibly be the case because I don't think we have anywhere near that number of HIMARS. And actually, the Russians have been sort of, A, the Russians were probably inflating their figures, but B, also they were hitting inflatables. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty small investment for an outsized impact. I mean, if you imagine that for example, a rocket launcher, or what Mikhaila told me they were planning on building next, which is a Patriot air defense battery, which is an extremely expensive piece of kit, but they're going to build a dummy. Now, for the Russians, that would be a really sort of prized target, because Ukraine is running low on air defenses. The more they can destroy them, the more they can sort of bomb Ukrainian cities into submission. But if Russia decided to sort of attack it, thought they had seen a Patriot battery, attacked it, they would probably use several missiles worth millions of pounds, and in one strike they could waste 5-10 million pounds or something like that, all for a cost of, like you say, 10,000 from the Ukrainian side. So the economics of it makes sense for the Ukrainians to kind of use decoys.